Welcome to today's talk. My name is Joseph Giacomin, and today I'm going to discuss a topic which is increasingly important in design, which is ethics, design ethics. So why ethics? Ethics because as designers, we design things, objects, artifacts, and these artifacts end up being always intermediaries. They're things that come between us and the three other bodies or three other entities which we tend to interact with. An artifact its usage and its characteristics can affect how we discuss things or negotiate things or think about things within ourselves. Our will and our desires, our subconscious, we can be sitting there thinking about some issue, and we will take into consideration how the artifact we will need to use as part of the process, what characteristics it has, and how it shapes it. It makes certain things possible and other things not possible. So artifacts that we use will be affecting what we're thinking and what we're trying to achieve. Artifacts that we use will affect how we relate to other people, to our fellows. Just think of giving a lift down to the local shops to your mate. The car that you're driving, its characteristics is shaping how long it takes and how comfortable you are and what music you're playing. It'll be shaping many characteristics of the interactions you're having with your friend on the way there. And certainly the artifacts that we design affect our interactions and relationships to the universe, to the cosmos. From the beginning of time, human beings have been making artifacts to make life easier. We've been designing things and building things which help us to achieve things and do things in an easier way, from a hammer to a lever to any kind of machine to today's robots. We are constantly designing things to help us to overcome certain difficulties and certain barriers in nature. So anything we design will affect our interactions with the three entities that we interact with every minute of every day. And it's important to note that ethics is important also because there's no such thing as an artifact or a technology which is neutral. Anything we design and build, anything people use, affects what they do and what they think and how they interact with others. To some extent, it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. We cannot add something to the system, to people's lives, without affecting their lives. So, as designers, we have a great responsibility to try to do the best we can to make their lives pleasant and agreeable and effective and efficient. And ethics these days becomes more and more one of the considerations, which is setting the outer barrier of what we should or can design. Traditionally, we've designed machines that didn't have too much automation, too much decision making, and it was a matter of overcoming the laws of physics, being consistent with the second law of thermodynamics, being consistent with Newton's laws and other laws of physics. If we could design something that was consistent with that and wasn't constrained by that would work. But more and more we have automation. More and more the automation is delegated decisions, and more the decisions are complicated decisions which affect our lives. So we have an outer limit of, or a barrier given by ethical considerations. In this diagram proposed some years ago by Giro suggested much of what we do on a day-to-day basis when we're designing is of a routine nature. They are designs which use materials, processes, they have costs, they have characteristics, technologies which are not unusual, they're known, and we're doing something interesting with it. Some designs, there's a space for designs of an innovative nature, more disruptive rather than incremental designs. We're innovating, we're changing something about the technology, we're changing something about its effects on people's lifestyles or how it fits people's values. But then, of course, very few things, if anything, in this world is infinite. Therefore, we have an outer limit. Traditionally, that barrier has been a physical one. Get it to work within the laws of nature. These days, quite often, the complexity and the tricky difficulty for designers is more of an ethical nature, and that provides the barrier, because if we go beyond that, People may not enjoy it. People may not agree with it. People may not be happy with the actions and behaviors of the artifact. And it's worth noting that when professionals and researchers and experts in the field look at the future of the design profession itself and what we probably will be working on in the 21st century in the coming years, a lot of the predictions, such as the ones shown here from Fast Company magazine from a few years ago, a lot of the predictions are areas which are quite obviously involving ethics, that have quite heavy ethical considerations to them: rethinking value creation, catalyzing change, biodesign, the future of our cities, designing these cities, mental health, the environment, and sustainability. So it's rather obvious that there's a lot of ethical, tricky issues that need uncovering, need discussing, and need some agreement on, so that we can proceed with our design if we will be working in these areas in the coming years. So what is ethics? What exactly are we talking about with the word? Well, ethics is basically any criteria, any logic, any thinking process which people use to decide whether they like something, they don't like something, whether they approve or disapprove, whether they consider it good or bad. So it's a system of moral principles. And ethics as a profession and as an activity is that branch of philosophy dealing with these rules, trying to find the commonalities, trying to find the characteristics, trying to describe how are people actually thinking about these matters and how they go about making their personal decisions about what they like and they don't like, what they agree is good and what they think is bad. Now, if we look at the ethical thought process or the ethical processing or the ethical debates that occur, they have to start somewhere. There's something implicitly or explicitly being used as the basis for the thinking process by any individual involved in that discussion. And ethicists will talk about ethical concerns, categories of things or values or abstract ideas which people care about and use it as a basis for thinking and check the characteristics of and compare things with. So if we take a look at ethical concerns, any list is quite lengthy. No list is exhaustive. It's not a scientific right or wrong type questions, not 2 and 2 is 4. But there are lists that are well documented, well used, and pop up routinely in conversation. One such list is Biagini and Fosi's list, which is shown above. And you can see the great variation of considerations that people keep in mind: aesthetics, flourishing, intuition, the rights. It's my right to this, or it's not my right to that. Agency, care, sympathy, character, revelation, tradition, and history. History, in my city, in my culture, what have we typically done in the past? Have we ever done it this way or not? Is there a reason why for hundreds of years maybe we did it in the other way? Does this design affect that in any manner? So these are all concerns. These are points of view or starting points or properties or parameters, if we wish to call it that, which people are using, and they're structuring their thinking around this. And that starting point is very important. Quite often the differences between people in heated ethical debates and in heated design team debates in the office is just simply that one person is focusing more on one of these concepts and the other person who's disagreeing is focusing more on another. So they may even share the same moral system and wish the same things for the users or for the customers or the clientele, but they're actually starting from a different point in terms of what they're looking at as being something that needs checking when they're making that design decision. Now, once we've focused on 1 or 2 or 3 concerns, and we're thinking about this situation or this option, this design choice we're about to make when we're designing our artifact, the next step, of course, is the moral theory or the moral processing or the moral system, whatever we want to call it. of how we go from I'm looking at these characteristics to I'm concluding this one is preferable and this one is less preferable. And there's a number of moral theories. In the next few slides, I'm only presenting a very small number of them. They're the ones that pop up the most in conversation. They're most commonly cited and discussed. But there's a large number because different cultures, different people, different parts of the world will have different ways of reasoning through these concerns and comparing these concerns to any given situation. But these are worth considering because they illustrate the diversity of these moral theories, these processing methods. Ethical egoism, the thing that's right for the person is the best option for the person. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Quite different, quite somewhat contradictory ways of reasoning through, starting from the same concerns possibly. Natural law, virtue ethics, going back to Aristotle and Plato. Kantian ethics, the best thing or the right thing to do is the one that's most consistent with the laws and rules we've all agreed to live by, regardless of the end effect of the choice or the action. If it's consistent with what we said we were going to do, it's the right thing to do, regardless of what happens in the end. So there's different ethical principles pushing us in different directions on the same concerns and the same reasoning. Further examples of moral theories, social contract theory. We live in a society, and either implicitly or explicitly, to some degree, our society is based on a social contract. There's things people expect from their society, expect from other people. There's things people know they have to do, pay their taxes, help out at work, whatever it is. There's certain gives and takes which are a social contract, either implicitly assumed or explicitly stated, as in work contracts and other legally binding documents. Feminist ethics, looking at the power structures involved. Is that design decision usable in the same manner for the same scope by everyone? Or do certain people have greater authority and greater ability to use it than other people do, thus affecting the power relationships and the freedoms and so forth of the people involved? So these are all different moral theories, the different ways of looking at things. Once we focus on a specific set of concerns that we wish to think about or discuss with our stakeholders or with our co-designers as we're doing our design process, these are ways, let's call it, of processing or proceeding forward with the ethical discussion. Now, it's obvious that there's many concerns. It's obvious that there's quite a few moral theories as well. So it's clear it's not going to be a simple yes or no answer to any sort of analysis of any sort of situation. It's complicated, and different people will favor somewhat more one answer as opposed to another because of the different concerns and the different reasonings. How do we navigate this complexity, given it's not mathematics, it's not 2 + 2 is 4, there's not an obvious answer? One very ancient manner, going back to antiquity, well documented in most of the holy books, is that of the golden rule. Whether it's stated positively or stated negatively, the gist or the basic message is, do unto others as you would wish it done to you. Choose the thing you think the other people you would like, and thus the other people will probably like as well. So the golden rule is very much a first person, personal, and thus contextualized and somewhat biased approach, because we're basically saying whatever design decision you make or whatever behavior you exhibit on a daily basis, make sure that, if you were on the receiving end, you would enjoy it, you'd be happy with it, you'd think it's a good idea. It's a reasonable rule, it helps navigate, but it's highly subjective and very first person personalized. So there's been a lot of discussions about can this be looked at in a different way? And one manner of trying to strip away a bit of the subjectivity and make it a little bit more generalized and a little bit more universal in its conclusion is the analysis of justice provided by Rawls in the early 1970s with his very influential book. He proposed a number of concepts. The ones we're focusing on here are what he referred to as the original position, or called differently the same thing. He also calls it the veil of ignorance. And basically the proposal is this: rather than leaving it as a first person subjective point of view, why don't we bring together groups of people with diverse ages, backgrounds, professions, interests, and so forth, and why don't we have them discuss and debate the decision or the new law of the government or whatever it is that we're currently working on? Why don't we have these people debate it and insist that they adopt the point of view of the veil of ignorance, meaning they do not know exactly how it will affect them personally. So let's strip away the subjectivity by saying you could be any member of society. You could be young, old, you could be a boy, a girl, rich, poor. You might live in the city, you might live in the countryside. You don't know. Do the reasoning, work your way through the problem, and come to some conclusion about which option is preferable based on the assumption that you could be any of the people who comes into contact with, if it's a design, with the artifact, or if it's a law of the government, you could be affected by the law. You could be any of the people who's affected by law, and you don't know which one you're going to be. So naturally, to be on the safe side, you would probably try to strip away some of the subjectivity and arrive at some conclusion which is somewhat utilitarian, which will be reasonable for you regardless of your circumstances and your situation. So the concept of original position or veil of ignorance is one way of stripping away some subjectivity and arriving at something a little bit more general and a little bit more acceptable to the vast majority of the people overall. But one thing that we must keep in mind, and it's very important these days as designers, is no matter how carefully we go about the decision making as to what the design objective is or what main characteristics we should focus on, there's still a challenge of implementation. We are designers, we live in the real world, we make things, some of them are very tangible, concrete artifacts, and they can't always achieve what we set out to do. Particularly from the point of view of ethics, we can invest a lot to come to a very clear set of conclusions about what functions the artifact should offer, what supports it should have, what interactions it might have with people, and what's preferable or not preferable from an ethical point of view. But we still face the challenge of implementation. Computers and algorithms and data sets don't always manage to do it the way we programmed it to do. And it's become an increasing issue in recent years, and it's been looked at by a number of researchers. And here is cited on this slide one example of the kinds of things that can go wrong. Insufficient knowledge or computational resources for the situation at hand. What if it's raining, the traffic is heavy, there's all kinds of confusions and characteristics in the current situation, and the autonomous vehicle simply cannot keep up with monitoring all the sensors and all the channels sufficiently to make the right decision about what it should do next as part of its driving. Moral dilemmas facing the artifact, the automation, result in something the person wanted being lost. Maybe it did exactly what we programmed it to do, but in the process of doing it, it frustrated the person because it made something else really complicated now, because it did something that messed up something else. And the designer couldn't be fully aware that that could happen in that context. It's just too much for the design process to consider. The morals being modeled are based on incorrect logic, insufficient data sets, or other flaws in the reasoning. We think that we programmed the chatbot to say the right thing, but it just happens to run into some people who don't like that way of talking or that particular set of words or that colloquial expression, and it suddenly gets a very bad response and creates a problem for the business that's using that particular automation, or loss of understanding or control of the ethical system due to the complexity of the situation. What if we never predicted a situation of this sort, and we never provided training data of this sort, and we don't have any backups or checks which could have caught it out? Well, the system can extrapolate its decision making incorrectly and come to a data point or a calculation which, when it acts on that, is not what the people wanted, and it could create a problem, and it could be ethically dubious what it does. Think of military hardware accidentally killing a civilian. There's things we never wanted to do. We thought that, but we've exceeded the ability of the system to reason through it properly. So there's a lot of implementation, day-to-day practical issues which go beyond the abstract logical conclusions we've drawn for our project and what we set out to achieve. And we must keep in mind these limitations, because there's a tolerance band or an error band that's somewhat unavoidable with automated systems, which means that whatever we're trying to achieve will probably not be perfect in practice. Now, what can we do as designers? Taking on board that we need to be clear about our concerns. Taking on board, it'd be helpful if we could all agree which particular moral theory we're more tending to favor as part of the debate in the design team, and then in discussions with the users as part of the ethnography and with the stakeholders. If we've done all that, and we've considered also the automation difficulties and so forth, we know that we're not going to arrive at a simple right or wrong answer, and there's going to be a number of open-ended questions left open, and the design process is not engineering. It won't be clearly documented each step of the way. However, we do have tools. It's not all hope is lost. We do have tools. And what do we do from a design perspective? We look at any guidance or guidelines or criteria that are available. We try to introduce these at different stages in the design process as part of conversation in the design team. We try to incorporate some of these values and criteria into the ethnography, and we certainly try to raise this with the stakeholders as checks to see if we're in the right direction and if we're choosing amongst the best option from amongst the available design choices we're looking at that point in time. Now, one set of guidelines that are referenced quite routinely and sometimes well documented about the position of the design team, where they stand in relation to this, so we know what we're getting at the end of the design process. Those of accessibility, universality, and inclusivity. The 7 principles of universal design are used by many design teams. They'll look at the principle of equitable use, flexibility, perceptible information, error tolerance, low physical requirements for the operation of the system. There's a series of somewhat abstract, somewhat general requirements or criteria. They don't tell us whether the artifact should be red or blue, or the button should be 10 millimeters or 7 millimeters in size. They're not specific to our design, but nevertheless, they're rally points, the criteria, the things we can think about, and we can check and we can document and just see if things we're doing in the design process are consistent with these criteria. For accessibility, usability, we have a set of principles. Then there's others I could have cited, but these are incredibly common and very, very frequently used. Now, these days, we also routinely check in most design practices issues of data transparency. With the increasing presence of automation in our lives, we're being asked for a lot of personal data and a lot of information from the systems as part of their usage. They're requesting input data from us so that they can do things for us. Now, what about this data? Is it the right amount? Where's it being held? How's it being used? What are the cybersecurity issues? Is it being sold on to other organizations? So there's a lot of questions about data transparency and what the user has the right to know and what should be made clear as part of the design process, what the objectives should be in this area. And several organizations have come up with criteria or guidance. OECD, that's cited here, is one that's being used quite a lot these days. And you can see the principles on the list in the table. Data collection principle. Why would you collect things that's not absolutely indispensable for the machine to know to work properly? If we're collecting extra or extraneous data, it must be for other purposes, and so forth and so on. There's a list of considerations, and we can use these as rally points. We can discuss them. We can check different design decisions, even practical decisions about what we're putting up on the menu system or the interface, or how the system is talking to the users. We can run checks against these criteria and see if we appear to be more consistent or less consistent with respect to these criteria, because they're somewhat good practice guidance for use in design. Algorithmic transparency. It's not just the data that's an issue with automated systems. What about the algorithm that's in there? A k-means clustering algorithm is not the same as a Bayesian estimator, which is not the same as a deep learning neural network. So the choice of the algorithm will lead to different characteristics in terms of robustness of the decision making, in terms of how well it extrapolates outside of its training data set, how well it interpolates within the training data set, and how stable the algorithm is numerically, and or how little subject it would be to failure due to overloads and other numerical errors within the algorithm. So there's questions about, what's actually doing the calculate. It's not just the data, but it's what it's doing with the data. How is the mathematics structured? Because mathematics, just like language, has biases built in to it. So knowing something about what the algorithm's doing is helpful. It helps us to anticipate, helps users to judge and to make decisions about it. Now, one set of criteria that's increasingly popular, the FATE. Fairness, accountability, transparency, explainability. These principles have been embedded in recent years in several new guidelines. Some European Union regulations and laws have come into effect where it's very obvious that these principles are embedded along with other considerations into these new documents. These are things, again, that are rally points or criteria that designers can check and discuss and maybe even document their design decisions in relation to these considerations. And then there's the increasingly important issue of trust. As the automation becomes more and more complex, as the personal assistant, as the financial advisor app, as the autonomous vehicle takes on levels of complexity which are becoming difficult to imagine what it's actually doing or how it actually works, and as they are delegated increasing numbers of decisions by the users, we have an issue now of, if we can't predict what it's going to do next, can we at least trust it? So we're not sure how it works. We don't know all the details of what's inside. It's too complicated to be fully confident of what it might do next. But can we at least trust it? And trust in recent years has been a subject of much analysis. And here's one set of criteria, which is increasingly used in practice. And these criteria are elaborating, explaining what the different forms of trust are. Trust in the beliefs. Is the organization which is making the automation, or at least putting it in the hands of people, is that organization working to certain values or certain principles that you'd assume would be embedded in the artifact, and thus you can sort of use that as guidance for what to expect or not to expect from the machine. Trusting the intention. Does the machine seem to react the same way to the same situation on different days, on different occasions? The behavior of the machine. Does it always seem to do a very simple, straightforward reaction or function as I anticipate, or does it occasionally do something more complex or elaborate or even erratic, which I really don't understand where that's coming from? System trust. Are there checks and balances in place? If this particular autonomous vehicle misbehaves, will that be noticed? Will it be caught? Will it be corrected by a human operator or an automation operator? Is there something in place beyond just the artifact itself, or at least does the artifact itself have multiple ways of controlling and multiple ways of interacting with the people? Dispositional trust, does it react in the same manner regardless of how you input the data or how you interact with it on that occasion? Situational decision to trust. Does it seem that the automation is accurate enough and predictable enough and reliable enough to, let's say, use the autonomous vehicle to travel to a famously dangerous neighborhood of the city at night in the dark when it's raining? Do I see that this particular automation is compatible with that situation that I intend to use it in or not? Or does the automation have characteristics or exhibit properties which make me think it may not work as well or be as safe in that other condition? So there's a series of characteristics or ways of trusting automation or artifacts in general, and increasingly they're becoming criteria, they're becoming rally points for design, these as well. They didn't start as guidance documents, they were just elaborations or discussions of what's actually occurring, clarifications of what kinds of trust there are, but very quickly they're becoming rally points and criteria we can discuss when making design decisions, when talking to users, when talking to stakeholders. And then finally, what about the environment? We know the environment is in a difficult place at the moment, and we know that whatever products, systems, or services we're designing, they do have some impact to some degree on the natural world, on the environment we live in. So increasingly, environmental concerns are showing up as ethical checks and ethical criteria and ethical principles, which designers are referring to during the design process, talking about with their users and with their stakeholders. Here's one recent example of a fairly extensive set of questions related to justice, sustainability, solidarity, participation, to different aspects of the design process and of the artifact itself that's being designed. These are questions. Not all of them will be relevant to every project or every artifact that's being designed, but they're an extensive set of questions which are worth considering, and some of them can definitely serve as rally points for most projects and most activities. And they provide checks, they provide topics for discussion, and they provide areas for documentation about the main design decisions which were made. Now, just as a few examples, just to show the diversity of concerns, the diversity of moral reasonings, and the complexity of moral decisions, ethical decisions, the fact that no design analysis and no design decision can ever be a simple right or wrong. Just a couple of examples to illustrate the complexities. The first one, an aesthetic, visual, interesting designer chair that we may see on the shops or online. If we start from the concerns of aesthetics or finitude, we may arrive at a different conclusion from an ethical point of view than if we had started with pain and pleasure, how comfortable the seat might be or what pleasures it might bring the person having it in their home. Or need. Do we really need that? Is it essential? Is it a core requirement? Or is it extra? Or is it something more additional to the basic requirements of life in our home? So if we take different concerns as the starting points, looking at the same artifact, we may draw different conclusions about whether the investment in time and money and effort to produce such an artifact is a good investment or a less good investment or a poor investment. Similar reasoning can be noted with the apps that were used during the pandemic recently for tracking the spread of the virus. In many countries, there were tracking apps sent out to people, and these apps on the cell phones or other digital devices were requesting personal information and we're monitoring things like locations of the person. Now, if we look and analyze the design of one of these apps from the point of view or concern of, let's say, rights or autonomy, we might come to a conclusion that all this personal data and monitoring where we are and so forth is not that consistent with human rights and personal autonomy. If instead we take as the starting concerns things like care or need of a medical nature, particularly, we conclude very quickly, particularly if we use a utilitarian framework for the analysis or the processing of the thoughts, we will very quickly conclude this is a very beneficial and a very valuable app, and certain things should be included in the interface of the app to gather more information and make the picture clearer to the medical workers. If we take the point of view of the authority, ethical questions emerge very quickly about who should be in charge of this, who should be organizing this, and do they have the right to ask me to use it if for some reason I don't particularly agree with having this on my phone. So something as simple as tracking a bit of person's data and their location very quickly raises a lot of questions which come to somewhat different conclusions from a design point of view, depending on your starting point of which concerns you're wishing to focus on with that particular design. Another well-known case history, if we wish to call it that, the design differences between Airbus and Boeing on their aviation controls. To some extent, these two manufacturers, the world's two biggest manufacturers of civilian aircraft, their systems are a lot more similar than some of the public debates may indicate. However, there are differences in the design philosophy of the cockpits, the flight controls of the two different manufacturers. And the situation is one where Airbus, in certain situations, if the large array of sensors and the vast amount of onboard calculation, computational abilities, if the automation is suggesting a danger or an error condition or something that should be corrected or dealt with, to some extent, the automation is allowed to override flight controls input or decided by the pilot. On the other hand, Boeing, for similar difficulties, similar anomalies, or similar loss of lift on flight surfaces, the Boeing, if there's a contradiction between the pilot input on joystick or other commands and what the automation is suggesting as the best path at the current point in time, the Boeing will usually override the automation and the pilot's control will override the automation, and the plane will respond to what the pilot requested. So the differences may be smaller than what sometimes seem to be the case, but nonetheless there are differences where automation in certain circumstances have the final decision on the Airbus, whereas in those exact same circumstances might possibly not have the final decision. It's the pilot who might have the final decision on the Boeing. And this is an interesting ethical point. If we look at this situation from the point of view of agency, authority, autonomy, what should the automation be allowed to do? What should the automation be expected to do? And who's responsible when something goes wrong? There's a lot of texture and a lot of detail that can emerge very quickly as an ethical debate with influence on the design choices. The two manufacturers have gone down different routes. Some commonalities exist, but their decisions help to shape their design philosophy, which simplifies a little bit their decision making, because certain things are agreed at the beginning that's their position ethically and that's the way it's going to be implemented. Now we can check against that with the various things we're actually designing and building. And then finally, the case that we see more and more on television and in the media the relationship between people and automation, particularly between people and robots. There's a lot of toy robots these days. There's a lot of health robots traveling down the hallways of hospitals and medical centers. A lot of robots and automation in the workplace, on your computer. There's assistants. Financial investors are automated these days. So there's a growing number of relationships between people and different automated systems, and many of these relationships have emotional basis. They have entertainment basis, and they could even have a basis of friendship or companionship. The example shown on the slide, the Aibo toy dog by Sony, that is a source of entertainment for people, and in some cases it becomes a friendship or even a relationship. It's not difficult to imagine an elderly person who doesn't have many family members nearby that come visit and don't have that many friends in their building and spends a lot of time alone. And the toy may provide not just entertainment, but may slowly become a figure, a presence in the home, and become a bit of a friend, if not a companion. And questions of an ethical nature are quickly arising on, is this good? Is it bad? Is it indifferent? How should we approach these types of designs? What kinds of things should we be asking as part of the design process? Now, again, depending on the concerns and the moral theories we adopt, we may come to different conclusions. If we look at concerns such as flourishing or harmony, if we see that the individual is enjoying this automation and seems to be cheerful and happy, and maybe that helps them to be healthier, we would come to a fairly quick ethical decision of, from that point of view, if that's the issue, this is a good idea, and we should be emphasizing any characteristics in the device which lead to greater interaction, more animal-like or human-like behaviors, and who knows, maybe even speech or other characteristics to maintain conversations, to help cognitive development and cognitive stability of the individual. If instead we look at it from the point of view of natural law or tradition as our main concerns, clearly this is a fairly new innovation. We don't have centuries or millennia of robots or chatbots or other automated systems. Traditionally, we would have sought entertainment and companionship in animals or other people. So from these points of view, these concerns, the ethical reasoning, the process could lead us to a conclusion of, okay, but this is not to be incentivized because it's so different and it's not something we wish to see too much growing in our society. So we can arrive at different conclusions depending on what we wish to focus on as a concern. So this is another good example of the complexity of ethical decision making and ethical decisions at every step of the design process. Thank you very much for your time and patience with this. I hope that in the arc of this rather lengthy talk with lots and lots of things we've touched upon, hopefully there was something in there that was of some use to you. Hopefully, if nothing else, it's become very clear that as designers, it's really helpful if we can be a little bit clearer in identifying our main concerns and how that relates to the branding and other characteristics of our design. If we can do that early on, right at the beginning of the process, it might simplify some of the decisions and at least simplify some of the meetings. Certainly, if we can be transparent about what systems of moral reasoning or ethical reasoning we're adopting, that helps too, because it communicates and helps explain why some of the decisions might have been the ones we did take with our artifact that we were designing. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with you again on the next occasion. Thank you kindly. Cheers.